In March of 2003, a climber left a hostel at the base of Ben Nevis. The morning was gray, the air sharp, the trail wet with thawing snow. His name was written in the hostel's logbook. By nightfall, he had not returned. Search teams flew, combed the ridges, and marked coordinates through the storm. All they found were scattered pages from a journal. The ink bled into the snow. The search was called off. He was declared lost. For years, the mountain held its silence. Families moved on. Reports were filed away. Until fragments surfaced again. Pages, belongings, and then a voice, recorded during a rescue. Proof that the mountain had not claimed him after all. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from today. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. The town of Fort William stirred slow on that March morning. Frost clung to parked cars, and a thin drizzle hung low across the rooftops. Ben Nevis rose beyond, the highest peak in Scotland, pale under cloud, its ridges hidden and revealed in fragments as the mist shifted. At 6 a.m., a man stepped outside the Glenhaven hostel, tugging his hood tight. His name was Ewan Calder, a climber who had traveled north alone for a late winter ascent. He carried a modest rucksack, a coil of rope strapped across it, and in one hand a brown leather notebook, worn at the edges, the strap loosened by years of use. Inside the hostel, the light was still faint. The common room smelled of damp wool drying by the radiator. Fiona Ross, the hostel manager, stood by the kettle, waiting for the water to boil. She heard the door open, the faint thud of boots on stone. A moment later, Ewan stepped back in, wiping drizzle from his glasses. He turned the hostel register toward him, bent over, and signed his name in careful letters. E. Calder, Summit, 6 a.m. Fiona glanced at it, then turned back to the kettle. She thought little of it. Dozens of names filled that book each season. None of them carried weight until the searchers came looking. Ewan sat on the bench near the door, pulled out the notebook, and wrote 2 short lines. He always began with words, even before climbing. He folded the notebook into his jacket pocket, checked the rope, then walked out. His boots splashed through puddles on the gravel, each step fading into the gray. By mid-morning, the weather thickened. Clouds sank lower, hugging the slopes. Locals in town shook their heads, noting how quickly the mountain could turn. Guides advised their clients to stay on lower paths. Yet a slim figure was seen by 2 hikers on the south face approach, jacket hood drawn close, rope slung neat across the pack. They thought little of it until days later, when they described him to the police. The afternoon brought harsher gusts. Snow flurried in brief waves, carried sideways by wind. The ridges disappeared, then reappeared like fragments of a broken wall. Above the tree line, the mountain grew silent. Sound seemed to vanish, muffled by mist and falling snow. If Ewan cried out, no one heard. Back at the hostel, Fiona moved through her routine. By 4 p.m., most of her guests had returned. Boots gathered by the entrance, steaming socks draped near the radiator. Conversations filled the common room, hikers trading stories of abandoned ascents. One bunk remained untouched. Its blanket stayed tight, corners folded. On the counter, a brass key lay where Ewan had left it. Fiona frowned, then told herself it was too soon to worry. Climbers often pushed late into the evening. At 7 p.m., drizzle hardened into sleet. Guests lingered near the fire. Fiona checked the register again, her finger pausing on the morning's neat entry. Summit, 6 a.m. No second line showed his return. She closed the book with a dull snap. By 9 p.m., unease grew heavier. The bunk remained empty. She opened the window a crack, listening for footsteps, for the slam of the hostel door. Nothing. At 10:15 p.m., she picked up the phone. Her voice shook as she gave the details. On the other end, a rescue officer wrote them down. The entry in the mountain rescue duty log read, "Missing climber, male, last seen Glenhaven Hostel 6 a.m., destination, Summit." It was the first official mark of his disappearance. That night, wind battered the hostel shutters. In the dark, Fiona lay awake, certain she would hear the crunch of boots on gravel, certain he would walk back through the door. But dawn brought only more cloud and no sign of Ewan. The first search team moved onto the south face. A helicopter circled, blades chopping the fog, then dipped away as visibility closed in. On the ground, 2 volunteers combed the slope. The snow was streaked with meltwater, rivulets carving tiny channels. Near a ridge, a page lay pressed into the ice, edges curling, words blurred. The volunteer lifted it gently. Ink had run across the page, smearing letters into streaks. Only one word could be read, repeated twice in slanted strokes. Cold. Cold. The page was slipped into a plastic sleeve, tagged, and carried down. Fiona held it in gloved hands, staring at the faint lines. She could not tell if it was a note, a thought, or a final plea. The brown leather notebook itself was nowhere to be found. Above the ridge, wind scattered more snow, covering tracks, hiding answers. All that remained was the single torn page, a fragment without context. A scrap of leather-bound paper vanished into the snow's mouth. The morning after the first torn page was recovered, Fort William felt like a town holding its breath. The drizzle had hardened to steady rain, pattering against slate roofs and running into narrow gutters. Outside the small cafes near the high street, chairs stayed stacked, no early climbers drinking tea or loading packs. The talk in town centered on the mountain, on the man who had not returned. Everyone knew how quickly weather on Ben Nevis could turn, but the thought of someone still up there gnawed at them. By 7 a.m., the car park at Glen Nevis filled with rescue vehicles. Headlights cut through mist, bouncing against wet asphalt. Engines idled, doors slammed. Voices moved brisk and clipped. Men and women in red jackets unloaded coils of rope, harnesses, stretchers wrapped in tarp, avalanche probes, and dogs pacing at their leads. Radios crackled, their static sharp against the stillness of the valley. Each movement carried a routine weight, the practiced order of people who knew how little time the mountain allowed. Douglas Kerr, 39, veteran of the Lochaber Mountain Rescue Team, pulled on his helmet and studied the ridge through binoculars. Nothing but gray. He had been on too many calls like this. Lone climbers lost in mist, their fate sealed long before the team reached them. But the fragment found yesterday complicated matters. A page from a notebook was not just debris. It suggested movement, survival beyond the first night. He signed the SAR duty log at 8:15 a.m., noting start of operations. Missing climber, male 33, known departure 6 a.m. previous day. Search grid south face priority. Behind him, Fiona Ross stood wrapped in her coat, pale from sleeplessness. She had insisted on coming to the car park. Her eyes never left the equipment being unloaded, as though watching the process itself might conjure Ewan back down the slope. At 9 a.m., a helicopter rose into the fog, blades chopping the sky until clouds swallowed it whole. On the ground, teams divided into pairs, marked by colored armbands, each assigned a sector. Dogs whined impatiently, straining against their handlers as they moved into the drizzle. One hiker, a German man named Marcus Hoff, approached the command jeep. He had been on the mountain the day before and thought he might have seen a lone figure near the south face approach. "Slim, with rope," he said, gesturing. "Hood tight." He did not stop. His statement was written on a clipboard and logged at 9:30 a.m. It was vague, but it aligned with Fiona's account of Ewan's gear. By 10:03 a.m., a call came through the radio. A search dog had barked sharply, nose pressed to churn snow near a ridge. Douglas and 2 volunteers hurried there, boots sinking into slush. The handler bent, pulled at a scrap half buried. It was another page, edges waterlogged, but less destroyed than the first. Douglas slid off a glove and held it up carefully. Ink bled at the edges, but some words held. "South face, ridge unstable. Keep moving." The strokes were jagged, uneven, as though written with numb fingers. He placed it into a plastic sleeve, capped with a marker, then logged coordinates and time in his notebook. The duty log would later show 10:03 a.m., page recovered, Coordinates, south face grid C7. The effect on the team was immediate. Searchers who had moved cautiously widened their sweep, adjusting compass bearings. The page suggested Ewan had been alive long after he left the hostel. Fiona reached out when Douglas returned to the command vehicle. He handed her the sleeve, and she stared at the blurred words as though they might rearrange into sense. Her lips moved silently over them, repeating the broken lines until her hands trembled. By early afternoon, sleet hardened. Needles of ice rattled against helmets, stung faces, and blurred goggles. Radios hissed with half-heard transmissions, static cutting through coordinates. Dogs pressed their bodies low against the wind, whining, then barking as handlers coaxed them forward. Douglas squatted behind a boulder, map spread across his knee, penciling new lines where the search grid had shifted. The mountain swallowed sound, each gust like a curtain pulling across the slope. At 4 p.m., the leader called halt. Snow drifted over footprints faster than the team could follow. The risk of avalanche grew as the wind scoured the ridges. Douglas raised his radio, his voice flat. "All units descend. Repeat, descend. Conditions deteriorating." Slowly, pairs regrouped, red jackets dotting the white expanse, moving down in staggered lines. Back at the car park, headlights burned through thick mist as rescue vehicles loaded up. Wet gear clattered into metal bins. Dogs shook ice from their coats. Volunteers stamped their feet against cold. Fiona lingered at the edge of the lights, watching each person come in. Her eyes searched for a figure who never appeared. In Douglas's hand, the plastic sleeve with the page flickered under the floodlight, edges fluttering in the wind like a pulse refusing to stop. The mountain gave no more that day. Only blurred ink, jagged handwriting, and silence heavy as stone. Words smeared by snow trembled like the last breath of a voice. Dawn rose dim on the third day. The clouds hung heavy and low, pale curtains sliding across the summit of Ben Nevis. Trucks returned to the Glen Nevis car park before 7 a.m. Engines idling, windows fogged with breath. Rescue crews moved slower now, the wear of sleepless nights clear in their faces. Each man and woman knew the odds diminished with every passing hour, but the torn pages demanded persistence. They proved movement, proved struggle. Somewhere on the mountain, Ewan Calder had left pieces of his life behind. Douglas Kerr gathered the team beside the command jeep, map pinned flat under a stone. His pencil traced yesterday's coordinates, a thin circle around grid C7. "We extend north," he said, voice steady though his eyes were rimmed with fatigue. "Pair rotations every 3 hours. No solo sweeps." The words carried authority born from too many recoveries. Each rescuer nodded, clipped on harnesses, adjusted helmets, checked radios. By 9 a.m., they pushed into the mist again. Snow hissed against their jackets, gusting in irregular sheets. Dogs led the way, paws sinking deep before scrambling out. The mountains seemed determined to swallow any trace, but near the south ridge, a faint indentation drew notice. Boot prints, distorted but distinct, appeared where wind had carved back a layer of drift. Douglas crouched, brushing with his glove, then pressed a measuring rod into the snow. The impression matched a men's size 10, depth suggesting 40 kilos of load. He photographed the print, time-stamped 9:40 a.m., logged as potential match to missing climber. Nearby, a glove lay half-buried, its fabric stiff with ice. Fiona, waiting below, would later confirm it was Ewan's, gray wool, frayed at the cuff. The glove was sealed in a plastic bag, the logbook entry reading, "Found adjacent to prints, south face grid C9. The team pushed higher, but conditions worsened. At noon, a blast of wind nearly knocked one volunteer off balance, his crampons scraping against stone. The radio crackled with Douglas's order, "Hold positions, no heroics." Snow swept horizontal, stinging eyes and numbing fingers. Above, ridges blurred and vanished. By 2 p.m., they reached a slope scarred by recent slide. Snow had torn down from the upper ridge, leaving a fan of debris scattered with broken branches. Douglas scanned with binoculars, jaw tight. Avalanches on this face often buried what was left. The team moved carefully, probing with poles, eyes sharp for color against the white. At 2:30 p.m., a volunteer called out. Half under ice, a boot print ended abruptly. Beyond it, only churned snow. The implication was clear. The climber had been swept into the slide. Douglas marked the spot with a red flag, radioed the coordinates. The report carried a chill. Presumed entrapment. South face. Slide zone active. The team lingered, probing deeper, but the mountain gave nothing back. With weather worsening again, Douglas called halt at 4 p.m. Reluctantly, pairs descended, silence heavier than before. Each rescuer carried the weight of the glove, the boot prints, the abrupt ending. At the base, Fiona clutched the sealed bag with the glove inside. She pressed it to her face, inhaling as though it still held warmth. The log entries spoke of disappearance, but she could not accept them. Not yet. On the ridge above, the red flag snapped in the wind, marking a spot where footsteps ended. Snow buried the trail, leaving only silence and a torn glove. The third night settled over Fort William with a weight that pressed even the most stoic locals into silence. Newspapers printed the words no family wanted to read. Climber presumed dead on Ben Nevis. Headlines sat on breakfast tables the next morning beside half-drunk mugs of tea. In the tiny church off High Street, candles flickered for the missing man. His name hung in the air like smoke, spoken softly, as if saying it too loud would seal his fate. At noon, a dark car pulled into the hostel yard. Agnes Calder, Ewan's mother, stepped out slowly, her coat buttoned tight against the chill. She was a woman in her late 60s, with strong shoulders hardened by years of farm work, but her eyes betrayed the fear of someone suddenly unmoored. Fiona hurried out to meet her, holding the plastic sleeve that contained the second notebook page. She offered it like an apology, like proof of something she did not wish to confirm. Agnes pressed the page flat with her fingers, straining to read the smudged lines. "I know his hand," she whispered. "Even blurred, I know it." The rescue base had shifted to a larger tent near the car park. Inside, maps covered folding tables, red lines crossing ridges already searched. Volunteers moved in and out, their boots caked with frozen mud. Agnes stood among them, out of place yet unshaken. She asked questions quietly, her voice steady. Where was the last sign? What had the dogs tracked? How far had the avalanche reached? Each answer chipped at her hope but did not break it. By evening, a formal statement was logged. No survivor signals detected after 72 hours. Presumed fatality. It was procedure, not cruelty, but the word spread quickly. Reporters gathered at the edge of the car park, cameras wrapped in plastic. Their lenses pointed toward the mountain that now seemed indifferent. Douglas Kerr delivered the news to Agnes in the small hostel lounge. He removed his helmet, held it in both hands, and spoke with the careful cadence of a man who had done this too many times. "The conditions are severe. The slide area, it's likely he was taken." Agnes listened without interruption, her gaze fixed not on Douglas, but on the notebook page folded on her lap. "No," she said finally, voice firm. "If he were gone, the mountain would keep everything, but it gave me this." She smoothed the paper with her palm. The ink had faded further, yet she clung to it as if it pulsed with life. Fiona sat beside her, unable to meet her eyes. The other guests moved quietly through the hostel, avoiding the lounge as though grief might spill into them. Outside, sleet struck the windows in waves, drumming like an unanswered knock. That night, Agnes refused to sleep in a guest room. She stayed in the common area, the page resting on the table before her. Each time wind rattled the shutters, she lifted her head, listening, as though a sun might return with the storm. On the mountain, search flags whipped under freezing gusts, marking voids in snow where footsteps had ended. No one saw the small scrap of paper shift loose from a crevice, fluttering weakly before being pinned again by ice. The mountain kept its silence, while a mother clutched blurred words in her hands. The following morning broke in weak light, a pale sun fighting to pierce layers of cloud. The mountain slopes glistened under a new sheen of ice, deceptive in its beauty. The official search had been scaled back overnight, yet volunteers trickled in regardless, faces drawn but resolute. Ben Nevis had a reputation for claiming lives, but few could stomach the thought of giving up while fragments of the climber's notebook still appeared. At 9 a.m., a university student named Isla McLeod, volunteering on her term break, set off with 2 others along a lesser-used spur trail. They moved in silence, eyes down, probing drifts with their poles. After an hour of trudging, Isla stopped short. Wedged under a rock outcrop, pressed flat by ice, lay another scrap of paper. She brushed snow away carefully, tugging until it came loose. The page bore more writing than the others. Though edges were water-stained, several sentences remained clear. Took wrong path, south face too heavy, must keep moving east. The strokes trembled, but they told of intent, of decision, of a man still reasoning through exhaustion. Isla shouted for the others. Douglas Kerr arrived minutes later, sliding down the slope to meet her. He examined the page, his face unreadable, before slipping it into a plastic sleeve. At 10:03 a.m., he logged the find in the SAR radio. Recovered page, eastward indication, coordinates recorded. The discovery shifted the grid once more. Search leaders spread maps across the hood of a Jeep, marking a new line of possibility. It meant Ewan had not been buried immediately in the avalanche. He had chosen another route, one that veered toward a dense stand of pines further east. Word of the page spread quickly. Reporters at the car park scribbled into notebooks, framing the story not as a recovery, but as a chase. Climber still alive. On Ben Nevis, ran the speculative headline by late afternoon. Agnes read it without flinching. She already knew, she told Fiona. She had felt it when her fingers traced the words. By noon, volunteers pushed into the eastern grid. The terrain grew steeper, stones jutting through thin snow, streams of meltwater cutting unpredictable channels. The mist thinned briefly, enough to show dark shapes of pines ahead. For the first time in days, a trace of direction emerged. At 1:45 p.m., Douglas's radio hissed with a clipped voice. Fresh fragments sighted. Possible shelter nearby. He drove the team forward. Under a ledge, another torn sheet clung to rock by frozen moss. The ink was faint, but a single line could be read. Fire. Keep warm. Don't stop. It was enough to ignite something among the searchers. Proof of fire meant action. Proof of warmth meant life, however fleeting. They pressed deeper, marking coordinates, red tape tied to branches for the next rotation of teams. When the group returned near dusk, exhaustion hung over them, but a glimmer of urgency remained. Fiona met Douglas as he unloaded his pack. He handed her the sleeve with the latest fragment. She placed it on the table beside the others, arranging them like broken verses of a single desperate song. That night, Agnes read them aloud, her voice soft but steady, as if reciting scripture. Each blurred line carried the cadence of survival. Each word extended her son's presence by another hour, another step. In the wind outside, the mountain shifted and groaned, indifferent. But inside the hostel, scraps of a notebook lit a fragile hope. A torn page whispered eastward, like breath caught in the mist. The storm relented briefly the next morning, leaving a fragile calm. Fort William stirred with new tension. News had reached the town that more pages had been recovered. Where earlier headlines had all but declared a death, today's whispers bent toward survival. At the bakery near the square, locals leaned across counters, trading what they'd heard. That the climber had written of fire, that he was moving east, that he was still fighting. By mid-morning, the car park at Ben Nevis was crowded not just with rescue trucks, but with journalists. Tripods sprouted in the mud, microphones poised, lenses pointed toward the mountain hidden under cloud. Ewan Calder walked past them without pause, coat drawn tight, her steps steady. Fiona trailed behind, protective, carrying a thermos of tea. Agnes ignored the questions called after her. She had no interest in speculation. Her focus remained on the fragments, the words that carried her son's presence across the snow. Inside the command tent, Douglas Kerr unfolded a fresh map. Red tape traced the eastward route suggested by yesterday's finds. Volunteers circled, noting sectors to sweep. Radios checked, coordinates logged. Yet just as the team prepared to move, a police officer entered with a new report. A man from Ben Nevis village, Murdo Fraser, claimed he had glimpsed a lone figure 2 nights earlier near the tree line. Staggering but upright, something clutched in his hand. His statement was written quickly, date and hour noted, then filed. Douglas read the report twice, expression flat. He knew how rumors spread during searches, but the detail about the object caught him. A book or small bundle, Murdo had said. Fiona's breath caught when she heard it. Agnes closed her eyes. She imagined the brown leather notebook, still gripped tight even as strength faded. Teams moved out at 11 a.m., fanning eastward. Snow was patchy in the lower slopes, replaced by mud and slick stones. The wind carried scents of pine, sharper here than on the open ridges. At noon, one group paused to photograph faint impressions along a muddy trail. They were too distorted for certainty, but the stride length matched an adult male moving unsteadily. The logbook entry recorded 12:10 p.m., possible tracks, eastward alignment. Meanwhile, back in town, the fragments had taken on a life of their own. A local newspaper printed a photocopy of one page. The words, "Fire, keep warm, don't stop." Barely legible. Strangers read it as if it were a message left to them personally. Some called it bravery, others futility. In the pub that night, a group of hikers raised glasses to the man still fighting above the mist, though none could say if he yet lived. Agnes sat in the hostel lounge, the photocopy laid before her, the original fragments stacked neatly beside. She ran her hand over them as though smoothing creases in her son's shirt. Fiona watched from the doorway, unable to break the silence. On the mountain, night closed fast. Searchers marked their sectors with reflective tape before retreating. From the valley floor, the ridges were invisible, swallowed by black. Only the thought of pages caught in snow gave shape to the darkness. A witness spoke of a shadow clutching a notebook near the trees. The weather shifted again, as if the mountain itself allowed brief mercy. Morning broke with clearer skies, pale blue slivers opening above the summit. For the first time in days, sunlight touched the ridges, gleaming off snowfields and broken ice. The search team seized the chance. By 8 a.m., ropes were coiled, stretchers strapped, dogs restless to be moving. The command tent buzzed with sharper energy, a mixture of fatigue and renewed determination. Douglas Kerr spread the updated grid map across the Jeep's hood. His pencil tapped the eastern sector where the last fragments had been found. "We focus here." He was moving. That means he kept clear of the worst slide zones. "Stay tight. Mark every sign." His voice was clipped, almost harsh, but the team understood. Hope demanded discipline. At 10 a.m., 2 volunteers stumbled upon a torn strap half buried in snow. Beside it lay a battered rucksack, seams split, fabric darkened with damp. The pack was lifted gently, its contents logged on the spot. A rolled map, a dented flask, and 2 intact pages from the brown leather notebook. Douglas bent low, unfolding one carefully with gloved hands. The words were still visible. "Cold worse. No shelter. Must keep east. Don't stop writing." The log entry read, 10:45 a.m. Rucksack recovered. Contains map, flask, notebook pages. Coordinates D-4. The find was more than debris. It proved movement, choices, the will to document. The rucksack was sealed, carried down the slope for later analysis. By noon, the wind stiffened, but the sun still held, burning away thin mist. Near a cluster of boulders, another discovery emerged. A page fluttered against rock, pinned by ice. When freed, it revealed a shaky sketch of ridges, a crude X marked at the base of a ravine. Douglas compared it against the official map. The X corresponded to a narrow gorge known for sudden drops, a place no climber willingly lingered. Yet the page suggested Ewan had marked it deliberately. Word spread quickly through the radios. Teams converged, pushing toward the gorge. At 2 p.m., they reached its edge. The place was a wound in the mountain, jagged stone walls, ice clinging like veins, wind moaning low through cracks. Searchers anchored ropes, leaning carefully over the lip, scanning for signs. At the base, snow lay drifted against boulders, disturbed by what looked like broken branches. No body, no voice, but proof of presence. A scrap of cloth snagged on stone. It was from a jacket sleeve, dark blue, the fabric ripped at the seam. Fiona would later confirm it matched the one Ewan had worn when he left the hostel. By 4 p.m., with light fading, the gorge was flagged and logged. The team descended with the rucksack, the cloth, and the notebook pages. The items were laid out under a floodlight back at the car park, photographed, tagged. Volunteers stood silently as the objects were cataloged, each one bridging the gap between loss and survival. That evening, Agnes was shown the finds. Her fingers lingered on the map, tracing the crude X. She whispered, almost to herself, "He was telling us where to look." Outside, the gorge waited, cold breath rising from its depths. On the map, a red X glowed against the shadowed ravine. 10 days had passed since Ewan Calder left the hostel, and the mountain still gave its clues in fragments. The gorge flagged the day before became the next focus. By 7 a.m., ropes were uncoiled, carabiners clinking like dull bells as the rescue team prepared for descent. The air was brittle with cold, the kind that made breath feel sharp in the throat. Floodlights lit the ravine's lip as Douglas Kerr briefed his crew. 2 at a time, slow, watch for ice shear, mark everything. His voice carried no drama, only the steady cadence of routine practiced under duress. Lowered into the gorge, searchers pressed boots against stone glazed with frost. Their headlamps flicked across jagged walls, catching threads of fabric snagged in crevices. At the base, the snow lay churned, hardened with a crust of ice. Near a rock overhang, one of the volunteers called out. Against the soot-dark stone, there was a trace, a circle of char. Ash flaked at the edges, faint but unmistakable. A fire had been lit there. Douglas knelt, brushing his glove across the blackened patch. He scooped a pinch into a sample vial, the charcoal still faintly crumbly, not long extinguished. The SAR log later recorded, 8:25 a.m., fire site, residual ash warm to touch. The note meant more than any other: warmth, action, life. Beside the char lay 2 crumpled notebook pages, edges stiff from frost. Words leapt out between water stains. Cold worse, water gone, still moving. The scrawl was weaker, letters wandering across the page. Douglas held them up to the light, his breath fogging the plastic sleeve. He knew handwriting could outlast the body that made it, but this was proof of persistence. The discovery lit a spark among the team. Volunteers fanned out, probing further. By 11 a.m., they found signs of crude shelter. Branches dragged against stone, a hollow where snow had been scooped away. It was rough, desperate, but it spoke of willpower. Above, sunlight broke briefly, pouring into the gorge in white shafts. It struck the ash circle, turning black to glimmer. The air smelled faintly of char and pine resin. For a moment, everyone stood still, silent witnesses to a struggle carved into stone and paper. The news spread fast. Reporters at the car park scrambled to relay the update. Evidence of survival, as recent as 24 hours earlier. Agnes listened to the broadcast with Fiona by her side. Her hand clutched the thermos, knuckles pale, but her voice did not waver. "He's alive," she said simply. By late afternoon, snow began to fall again, light but insistent, threatening to cover the fragile traces. Douglas ordered reflective tape strung along the gorge, every entry point marked, every path logged for return. When the team finally withdrew at 5 p.m., they carried with them 2 pages more, a vial of ash, and the knowledge that a man had fought to live longer than anyone believed. In the fading light, the charred circles smoldered in memory. Ash in the gorge still whispered of warmth against the void. By the 11th day, the mountain had become a place of contradiction, despair layered over faint proof of life. Each new clue stretched the limits of belief. Locals murmured in shops and pubs, some convinced no man could survive so long in the open, others clinging to the notebook pages as gospel. The car park at Ben Nevis was lined with satellite vans now, cameras fixed on the ridges as if they might capture the mountain's next secret. At 8 a.m., Douglas Kerr briefed the weary crew. His voice carried the fatigue of too many cold mornings, but he pointed to the gorge on the map with renewed purpose. "We follow the east spur. Yesterday proved he was here within a day. Today, we push beyond." He did not add the thought that clung to him. Every hour mattered now. By mid-morning, searchers working the gorge's eastern edge uncovered another sign. Half buried beneath wind-blown snow lay a dark bundle. Gloves dug carefully until fabric emerged. A jacket, torn and stiff with ice. They lifted it out, spread it flat across rock. It was blue, the same shade Fiona had described when Ewan left the hostel. On the left sleeve, the seam ripped wide, dried blood staining the inner lining. The sight quieted the team. Douglas crouched, gloved fingers brushing the brittle cloth. The forensic entry was logged at 11:20 a.m. Jacket recovered, blood-stained, presumed subjects. Coordinates E2. The sample was sealed in a plastic bag, photographed under the stark light of a headlamp. The dark patches told their own story. Injury, struggle, survival measured not in days, but in dwindling strength. When the jacket was carried down later that afternoon, Agnes met it with trembling hands. She pressed the fabric to her chest, then pulled it close to her face. "It's his," she whispered. "I stitched this sleeve last winter." Her words hung heavy in the command tent, silencing even the reporters outside. But the jacket was not the only find that day. At 2 p.m., searchers uncovered another page, this one snagged under brush at the gorge base. The writing staggered across the sheet, letters thin and broken. Cold, blood, can't stop. East, keep fire. The page was logged, sleeved, and placed beside the jacket. The fragments together painted a picture no one could ignore. A man wounded, clinging to movement, determined to record each hour. Speculation grew fevered. Was the blood fatal? Was the notebook a trail of farewell or a guidepost for rescuers? In pubs that night, men argued over pints, voices rising. Some claimed he must be dead already. Others swore the ash proved otherwise. The mountain had become both executioner and accomplice, feeding scraps of evidence like riddles. Agnes remained calm through it all. She sat in the hostel lounge, the jacket folded across her lap, the new page laid beside the others. Fiona hovered nearby, afraid to break the silence. Agnes's eyes stayed on the words, lips moving as though she were speaking to her son across the distance. Above the gorge, wind swept through the pines, scattering loose snow over the flagged paths. The mountain closed over the day's finds, as if reluctant to give up more. On the torn sleeve, a dark stain hardened into silence. The 12th morning came with a brittle cold, but skies were clearer than they had been in weeks. Sunlight spilled across the valley floor, glancing off windshields in the Ben Nevis car park. For the first time, the peak was visible from town, sharp against the horizon, and it felt like an omen. Crews moved with urgency. Coffee steamed from metal mugs, radios hissed with clipped voices, and ropes were laid out across the frost-hardened ground. Douglas Kerr briefed the team at 6:30 a.m. His voice was steady, but beneath it throbbed the tension of dwindling time. "We sweep east again, full line. Follow the gorge base. Keep eyes up." The last fragment said, "Keep fire." That means he's still thinking. He let the silence hang for a moment. That means he might still be alive. By 7 a.m., the line of searchers climbed toward the pines. Boots crunched over crusted snow, dogs ranging ahead. The gorge funneled wind that rattled the branches and carried scents of ash and damp earth. At 7:05 a.m., one of the volunteers froze. From the trees, faint and broken, came a sound. A voice. Hoarse. Almost indistinguishable from the wind. They shouted, radios flaring with urgency. "Possible voice, East Gorge sector. Repeat, voice heard." The team converged. They pushed through undergrowth, branches snapping, until at 7:10 a.m. they found him. Ewan Calder lay half sitting against a boulder, his frame gaunt, jacket gone, shirt stiff with dried blood. His lips were blue, eyes glassy but open. In his hand, clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white, was the brown leather notebook. When the rescuers tried to ease it away, his fingers resisted. Douglas knelt beside him, checked for pulse, breath shallow but present. He pressed his radio. Subject located, conscious, hypothermic, 7:10 a.m. Request EMS immediate. The words became the new anchor in the log. Proof of life entered in official ink. The medics moved fast. Blankets unfurled, oxygen mask strapped, IV prepared. They noted injuries, deep laceration along the arm. Blood loss significant, but vitals still registering. The run sheet later read, patient located conscious, hypothermic, responsive to verbal cues. Transport initiated 7:25 a.m. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, Ewan's eyes flickered to Douglas. He whispered something inaudible, throat too dry for clarity. But he did not let go of the notebook. Even as straps tightened across his body, his hand clung to the worn leather, refusing surrender. The descent was slow, every step measured. Reporters pressed against tape at the car park as the stretcher emerged from mist. Cameras clicked furiously. Fiona gasped, tears cutting down her cheeks. Agnes stepped forward, her voice cracking. "Ewan!" When the stretcher passed, his eyes fluttered, but he saw her. His lips formed the word home, though no sound carried. Still, it was enough. The crowd stilled. The mountain, for once, had given something back. Through it all, the notebook remained in his hand, edges torn, pages smudged, yet intact. Frozen fingers clung to the notebook like a lifeline against death. The ambulance roared north through winding highland roads, siren cutting across valleys still glazed with snow. By 8:30 a.m., Ewan Calder was admitted to Regmore Hospital in Inverness. The emergency team moved swiftly, transferring him from stretcher to gurney, peeling away blankets stiff with frost. Monitors blinked. Nurses called vitals, the smell of antiseptic replacing the raw scent of pine and smoke. His condition was logged in the intake summary. Male, 33. Severe hypothermia. Core temperature 29 degrees. Laceration to left arm. Blood loss estimated 1 liter. Dehydrated. Malnourished. Responsive. Limited speech. These numbers became another kind of proof. The statistics of survival against impossible odds. Agnes Calder arrived by noon, led down the fluorescent corridor by Fiona Ross. The woman who had held torn notebook pages now held her son's hand, pale and trembling beneath tubes and dressings. She did not weep. She leaned close, whispering his name again and again, as though calling him back from a distance he had barely returned from. Doctors moved around her, noting the frostbite damage on fingers and toes, shallow lesions from exposure, signs of starvation. Yet they spoke cautiously of recovery. "He's stable," Dr. Lorna McKay told Agnes, her tone deliberate. "But the next days are critical." Agnes only nodded. She had lived those days already in the car park, the tent, the cold. This was no worse. Through the window of his room, the brown leather notebook lay on a steel tray, sealed in a plastic evidence bag. Its pages, torn and smeared, were spread on a side table under soft light. Nurses had catalogued it at intake. Personal item recovered from subject's hand, transferred to belongings. For Agnes, seeing it was like watching his heartbeat externalized. The object that had carried his presence through silence and snow. By evening, Ewan stirred. His voice rasped, words catching in his throat. A nurse leaned close, asking if he could recall his name. He whispered, "Ewan Calder." His eyes shifted to the tray, to the notebook just out of reach. Agnes followed his gaze. She placed her hand gently over his, promising he would hold it again. News of his survival swept quickly. Crowds gathered outside the hospital gates, reporters broadcasting under harsh lights. Headlines flipped overnight. Presumed dead climber found alive. Commentators spoke of miracles, of endurance, of the strange persistence of fragments that guided the search. Inside, the ward was quieter. Fiona sat in a corner chair, watching Agnes keep vigil. Douglas Kerr stopped by briefly, still in his rescue jacket, leaving a single message. "You wrote your way back to us." The mountain had given up its lost son. but the scars of exposure marked every inch of him. Tubes, wires, frost-bitten hands. He was both fragile and unbroken. On the tray, the notebook lay under sterile light, waiting like a witness. Spring pressed faintly at the highlands weeks later, thaw softening the snow line, streams running louder down the glens. In Inverness, the hospital windows were open to warmer air, and the ward where Ewan Calder lay recovering felt less like a battlefield. His weight had crept back slowly. The cuts across his arm had closed into clean scars. The frostbite lingered on fingers and toes, reminders carved by ice. But he could walk again with aid, each step steadying more than his body. On the first day he was able to sit upright without support, Agnes brought the notebook to his hands. The brown leather was cracked, the strap half torn, pages warped and stained. He held it against his chest for a long time before opening it. Inside, the fragments were jagged, sentences broken mid-thought, coordinates bleeding across margins. Yet they told the story more clearly than any report. Hours of movement, desperate notes about fire, hunger, and direction. It was survival written one trembling line at a time. When local authorities collected his belongings for official record, the notebook was logged as Exhibit A, Survivor Artifact. It joined the search reports, the ash sample, the blood-stained jacket, the glove, objects that traced a line from disappearance to recovery. In the small courtroom where the inquiry convened months later, the notebook sat on a table under stark lights, its presence enough to silence the room. Ewan himself appeared at that inquiry. Thinner, voice still rough but alive. He told the panel what he remembered. The avalanche roar, the fall, the hours clawing free. He spoke of lighting a fire under stone, of melting snow in a dented flask, of writing even when ink froze in its nib. "If they found the words," he said quietly, "they'd know I hadn't stopped." His testimony reframed everything. What had looked like a tragedy became a chronicle of endurance. Afterward, the notebook was not stored away. The council arranged for it to be displayed in the town hall, behind glass, pages open to the line, "Keep moving east." School children filed past it. Locals stood hushed before it. It was no longer just a climber's journal. It had become a record of will, a symbol of how words can outlast silence. For Agnes, it was simpler. She returned to her farm, kept one photocopy of her son's scrawl pinned above the kitchen table. Each morning she read the line aloud, the way she had in the hostel lounge. Fiona still ran the Glenhaven hostel, still kept the register open, though now she paused longer when guests signed their names. And Ewan, thinner but unbroken, walked the lower trails when spring finally cleared the snow. He carried no rope, no heavy pack. Only the notebook, repaired with new stitching, pages blank after the last scrawled plea. When the sun dipped behind Ben Nevis and the shadows lengthened across the glen, he would stop, thumb against the leather cover, listening to the quiet that once nearly took him. In the town hall, under a glass case, the notebook glowed under sterile light.